Sarah Mitchell never imagined that her worst day would lead to her most unforgettable encounter. The 24-year-old teacher from Manchester had saved for 2 years to visit London with her elderly grandmother, Rose. This trip was supposed to be their special bonding time, a chance to see the sights Rose had dreamed of visiting since childhood. The morning started perfectly. Sarah had carefully planned their itinerary, making sure every detail was perfect for her grandmother's comfort. Rose had been battling arthritis for years, and Sarah knew this might be their last big adventure together. They began their day at Westminster Abbey, where Rose marveled at the ancient stones and whispered stories about the kings and queens who had walked these same paths centuries ago. Their next stop was Buckingham Palace. Sarah had booked tickets for the staterooms tour, something Rose had mentioned wanting to do for decades. The elderly woman's eyes sparkled with excitement as they approached the grand gates. She clutched Sarah's arm tightly, not from weakness, but from pure joy. "I can't believe we're actually here, dear," Rose whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Your grandfather would have loved this. He always said we'd visit London together someday." Sarah smiled warmly at her grandmother, remembering the stories about her late grandfather, a man who had worked in a factory his entire life but dreamed of traveling. Rose had never had the opportunity or money to make such trips when she was younger. Now, at 78, she was finally living her dream. As they joined the queue for the palace tour, Sarah noticed her grandmother seemed more tired than usual. The morning walk had been longer than expected, and Rose's arthritis was clearly bothering her. Sarah suggested they sit on a nearby bench before joining the tour, but Rose was determined to keep going. "I've waited too long for this, Sarah. I'm not going to let a few aches stop me now," Rose said with the stubbornness that had carried her through decades of hardship. The tour began smoothly. Their guide, a well-dressed woman with an impeccable accent, led them through the magnificent staterooms. Rose was enchanted by everything she saw: the golden decorations, the priceless paintings, the crystal chandeliers that seemed to capture and reflect light like stars. She asked countless questions, her curiosity as sharp as someone half her age. Sarah watched her grandmother with growing concern, though. Despite Rose's enthusiasm, her steps were becoming slower and more labored. Her breathing seemed heavier, and she occasionally pressed her hand to her chest. Sarah had noticed these signs before. They usually meant Rose needed her medication and some rest. "Grandma, are you feeling all right?" Sarah asked quietly during a brief pause in the tour. "I'm fine, dear. Just a bit winded from all this excitement," Rose replied, but Sarah could see the strain in her face. They continued through the palace, but Sarah's worry grew with each room. Rose's color wasn't good, and she was gripping Sarah's arm more tightly than before. When they reached the throne room, Rose suddenly stopped walking. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice weak and shaky, "I think I need to sit down." Before Sarah could respond, Rose swayed on her feet. Sarah reached out to steady her, but her grandmother's knees buckled. In a matter of seconds, Rose collapsed to the ornate carpet of the throne room, her body going limp in Sarah's arms. "Grandma," Sarah cried out, her voice echoing in the grand room. "Someone help us, please." The other tourists turned to stare, some gasping in shock, others pulling out their phones to call for help. The tour guide rushed over, her professional composure momentarily shaken by the emergency unfolding before her. Sarah knelt beside her grandmother on the palace floor, checking for a pulse with trembling hands. Rose's breathing was shallow and irregular, her skin pale and clammy. Sarah had taken a first aid course years ago, but in this moment of panic, her mind went blank. "Is she breathing?" the tour guide asked, kneeling beside them. "Yes, but barely," Sarah replied, fighting back tears. "She has a heart condition. We need to call an ambulance immediately." As the guide made the emergency call, Sarah held her grandmother's hand, whispering words of encouragement. "Stay with me, Grandma. Help is coming. You're going to be okay." Rose's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and confused. She tried to speak, but only weak sounds came out. Sarah could see the fear in her grandmother's eyes, the same fear that was now consuming her own heart. The minutes felt like hours as they waited for help to arrive. Other tourists had been moved to different areas of the palace, giving them space, but Sarah felt completely alone in that vast, luxurious room. The irony wasn't lost on her. They were surrounded by centuries of British history and unimaginable wealth, yet her grandmother was fighting for her life on the floor. Sarah's mind raced with terrible thoughts. What if Rose didn't make it? What if their dream trip turned into a nightmare? How would she explain to her family that she hadn't taken better care of Rose? The guilt and fear overwhelmed her, and despite her efforts to stay strong, tears began streaming down her face. "Please don't leave me, Grandma," she whispered, squeezing Rose's cold hand. "I can't do this without you." The palace felt eerily quiet except for the sound of Sarah's quiet sobs and her grandmother's labored breathing. She looked around the magnificent room, with its red velvet chairs and golden decorations, and felt more helpless than she had ever felt in her life. That's when she heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching quickly across the marble floors. Sarah looked up through her tears to see a tall figure in a red uniform walking purposefully toward them. The palace guard's face was serious but kind, and something in his eyes told Sarah that their ordeal was about to take an unexpected turn. The guard who approached them was different from the ceremonial guard Sarah had seen outside the palace gates. This man moved with purpose and authority, his red uniform crisp and his bearing professional yet compassionate. His name tag read, Guard Williams, and his eyes immediately assessed the situation with the trained gaze of someone who had dealt with emergencies before. "Miss, I'm Guard Williams. I need you to step back slightly so I can help your grandmother," he said in a calm, reassuring voice that immediately made Sarah feel less alone. Unlike the other staff members who seemed uncertain about what to do, Guard Williams took immediate control of the situation. He knelt beside Rose with practiced ease, his large hands gentle as he checked her pulse and breathing. Sarah watched in amazement as his entire demeanor transformed from the stoic palace guard she expected to a caring first responder. "What's her name?" he asked Sarah while continuing to monitor Rose's vital signs. Rose Mitchell. She's 78 and has a heart condition," Sarah managed to say through her tears. "All right, Rose," Guard Williams said, speaking directly to the unconscious woman in a warm, grandfatherly tone. "My name is David, and I'm here to help you. You're in safe hands now." Sarah was struck by how he used his first name when speaking to her grandmother. It wasn't the formal, distant interaction she expected from a royal guard, but something much more personal and human. Guard Williams quickly produced a small medical kit from seemingly nowhere. Sarah realized this wasn't his first medical emergency at the palace. His movements were swift but careful, as he checked Rose's blood pressure and listened to her heart with a portable stethoscope. "Has she taken any medication today?" he asked Sarah while working. "Yes, her heart medication this morning, but she was supposed to take another dose at lunch. We got caught up in the tour and forgot," Sarah said, feeling another wave of guilt wash over her. "That's all right. These things happen," Guard Williams said kindly, never taking his focus off Rose. "Do you have her medication with you?" Sarah quickly retrieved Rose's pill organizer from her purse, her hands shaking as she showed him the small white tablets. Guard Williams examined them briefly and nodded with recognition. "I know this medication. My own mother took the same one," he said, which somehow made Sarah feel more confident in his abilities. "We're going to give her one of these tablets under her tongue. It should help stabilize her until the paramedics arrive." As Guard Williams carefully administered the medication, he continued talking to Rose in soothing tones, even though she remained unconscious. Sarah noticed how his voice changed when he spoke to her grandmother. It was softer, more personal, almost like he was speaking to his own family member. "You know, Rose, you picked a beautiful day to visit us," he said, while monitoring her, breathing. "The gardens are in full bloom right now. When you're feeling better, I'd love to show them to you personally." Sarah was amazed by his bedside manner. Here was a man whose job was to protect the royal family and maintain security, yet he was treating her grandmother with the tenderness of a family member. She had expected palace staff to be cold and formal, focused more on protocol than people. Within, A few minutes of receiving the medication, Rose's breathing became more regular and some color returned to her cheeks. Guard Williams smiled, the first time Sarah had seen his stern expression soften completely. "There we go," he said quietly. "She's responding well. Her pulse is getting stronger." The paramedics arrived shortly after, their equipment clattering, as they rushed into the throne room. Sarah expected Guard Williams to step back and let the medical professionals take over, but instead, he remained by Rose's side, providing them with a detailed report of her condition and the treatment he had already administered. "Patient is Rose Mitchell, 78 years old, known cardiac patient," he reported professionally. "She collapsed approximately 15 minutes ago, showed signs of cardiac distress. Blood pressure was low at 90/60, pulse weak and irregular. Administered 1 sublingual nitroglycerin tablet 5 minutes ago. Patient is now showing improvement, pulse stronger, breathing more regular, color improving." The lead paramedic looked at Guard Williams with obvious respect. "Good work, Guard. Your quick thinking probably prevented this from becoming much worse." As the paramedics prepared Rose for transport to the hospital, Guard Williams turned his attention back to Sarah, who was still kneeling on the palace floor, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "Sarah," he said gently, using her name, though she didn't remember telling it to him. "Your grandmother is going to be fine. The paramedics are excellent, and St. Mary's Hospital has one of the best cardiac units in London." "I should have been more careful," Sarah said through fresh tears. "I should have made sure she took her medication on time. I should have noticed she was getting tired earlier." Guard Williams sat down on the floor beside her, completely abandoning any pretense of formal protocol. His red uniform seemed almost out of place as he became simply a kind man comforting someone in distress. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You did nothing wrong. You brought your grandmother here to fulfill her dream. You were attentive and caring. Sometimes these things just happen regardless of how well we prepare." He paused, looking directly into Sarah's eyes. "I've been working at this palace for 12 years. I've seen hundreds of medical emergencies, and I can tell you that the people who care the most are always the ones who blame themselves the most. Your grandmother is lucky to have you." Sarah felt some of the crushing guilt begin to lift from her shoulders. There was something about Guard Williams' certainty and experience that made her believe him. "Will you come with us to the hospital?" she asked, suddenly terrified of facing this alone. Guard Williams glanced at his watch and then at the paramedics, who were now ready to transport Rose. Sarah expected him to explain that he couldn't leave his post, that duty and protocol prevented him from getting involved in visitors' personal emergencies. Instead, he stood up and brushed off his uniform. "Let me make a quick call to my supervisor," he said. "I think I can arrange to escort you both to the hospital." Guard Williams stepped away to make his phone call, speaking in low, urgent tones to his supervisor. Sarah could hear fragments of the conversation, words like medical emergency, elderly visitor, and personal escort. She prepared herself for disappointment, knowing that surely a palace guard couldn't simply leave his post to help strangers. To her amazement, Guard Williams returned with a slight smile on his face. "I've been granted permission to accompany you to the hospital," he announced. "My supervisor agrees that ensuring the safety and well-being of our visitors is part of our duty." Sarah felt a wave of relief so strong that she nearly started crying. Again. She had felt so alone and scared, facing the prospect of navigating a London hospital by herself while her grandmother's life hung in the balance. As they prepared to leave the palace, Guard Williams surprised Sarah again by his attention to practical details. He gathered their belongings, making sure nothing was left behind in the throne room. He spoke briefly with the tour guide, ensuring that their tickets would be honored for a future visit when Rose was well enough to return. "You'll want to come back and finish the tour," he told Sarah confidently, "and I meant what I said about showing your grandmother the gardens personally." The ambulance ride to St. Mary's Hospital was tense but hopeful. Rose remained stable, drifting in and out of consciousness but responding to the paramedics' questions when she was alert. Guard Williams sat beside Sarah in the ambulance, still in his full red uniform, looking somewhat out of place in the medical vehicle but providing a steady, reassuring presence. "Have you been a guard long?" Sarah asked, trying to distract herself from her worry. 12 years, Guard Williams replied. "I started when I was 26, right after my military service. It's been an honor to serve, but days like today remind me why I really love this job." "Days like today?" Sarah asked, confused. "The days when I can actually help people instead of just standing at attention," he explained with a gentle smile. "Don't get me wrong. The ceremonial duties are important, and protecting the royal family is a great responsibility, but being able to help your grandmother today, that's what makes this job meaningful." At the hospital, Guard Williams continued to go far beyond what anyone could have expected. While Sarah handled the admission paperwork, he spoke with the doctors, providing them with detailed information about Rose's condition and the timeline of events. His military bearing and obvious competence seemed to command respect from the medical staff. The guard mentioned that Mrs. Mitchell has been looking forward to this trip for years. Dr. Patel, the attending physician, told Sarah after examining Rose. "He's asked us to make sure we do everything possible to get her well enough to continue her visit." Sarah was touched that Guard Williams had shared such personal details with the medical team. It showed he had been truly listening to their story, not just going through the motions of helping. Rose was admitted to the cardiac unit for observation and treatment. Her condition was stable but serious. The doctors explained that she had experienced what they called a cardiac episode, brought on by overexertion and missing her medication. With proper treatment, she should recover fully, but she would need several days of rest and monitoring. As evening approached, Sarah expected Guard Williams to finally return to his duties at the palace. Instead, he approached her in the hospital waiting room with yet another surprise. "I've spoken with my supervisor again," he said. "I'm off duty for the next 2 days, and I'd like to help you and your grandmother in any way I can." Sarah was speechless. She had never encountered such kindness from a stranger, especially someone in such an official position. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, genuinely puzzled by his extraordinary generosity. Guard Williams was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the London streets below. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of personal experience. 3 years ago, my own mother collapsed while visiting me here in London," he said slowly. "She was from Scotland, didn't know the city at all. I was on duty at the palace when it happened, and by the time I got word and could get to the hospital, she had been alone for hours." He paused, the memory clearly still painful. "She was terrified and confused, in a strange place with no family around. I'll never forget how small and vulnerable she looked in that hospital bed, waiting for someone who cared about her to arrive." Sarah began to understand. This wasn't just about helping strangers. This was personal for Guard Williams. "She recovered fine," he continued. "But the experience taught me something important. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply be present for someone who needs us, even if we're strangers." That evening, Guard Williams helped Sarah find a nearby hotel and drove her back and forth to the hospital for visiting hours. He had changed out of his palace uniform into casual clothes, but his helpful, protective nature remained unchanged. When Sarah tried to thank him, he waved away her gratitude. "Your grandmother reminds me of my mother," he said simply. "Determined, curious, full of life. Women like that deserve to have their dreams come true." The next morning brought encouraging news. Rose was awake and alert, though still weak. When Sarah entered her room, she found her grandmother chatting with a familiar figure in civilian clothes. "Sarah, dear," Rose called out, her voice stronger than it had been the day before. "You'll never guess who's been keeping me company. This lovely man is the guard who helped me yesterday." Guard Williams stood up from the bedside chair, looking slightly embarrassed but pleased. "I hope you don't mind," he said to Sarah. "I wanted to check on how she was feeling and bring her these." He gestured to a beautiful bouquet of flowers from the palace gardens, the very gardens he had promised to show Rose when she was feeling better. "He's been telling me the most wonderful stories about the palace," Rose said, her eyes bright with interest. "Did you know that during World War II the palace was bombed 9 times? But the royal family refused to leave London? Sarah smiled, seeing her grandmother's natural curiosity and love of history returning. Guard Williams had clearly found the perfect way to lift her spirits. Over the next 2 days, Guard Williams became an unexpected part of Rose and Sarah's London adventure. What had started as a medical emergency had evolved into something neither of them could have imagined: a genuine friendship with someone who truly embodied the best of British hospitality. On Rose's second day in the hospital, Guard Williams arrived with more than just flowers. He brought photo albums from the palace archives, filled with historical images that he thought would interest Rose. His intuition was perfect. Rose spent hours poring over the black and white photographs, asking detailed questions about the people and events they depicted. This photograph was taken during Queen Elizabeth's coronation in 1953, Guard Williams explained, pointing to a picture of crowds gathered outside the palace. My grandmother was actually in this crowd somewhere. She waited all night in the rain just to catch a glimpse of the ceremony. Rose's eyes lit up with excitement. My grandmother told me stories about that day too. She listened to the entire ceremony on the radio and made my mother and aunt sit quietly through every minute of it. Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement. Guard Williams had somehow intuited exactly what would help her grandmother heal. Not just medical care, but mental and emotional engagement. He was treating Rose not as a patient or a tourist, but as a person with her own rich history and interests. Dr. Patel noticed the positive change in Rose's condition as well. Whatever that guard is doing, it's working better than any medicine I could prescribe, he told Sarah privately. Her heart rate has stabilized, her mood is excellent, and she's eager to get better. That kind of positive attitude makes all the difference in recovery. On the third day, Dr. Patel cleared Rose for discharge with specific instructions for rest and limited activity. Sarah was relieved, but also worried about how to manage the remainder of their trip. Rose was better, but still fragile, and Sarah felt responsible for ensuring nothing like this happened again. Guard Williams, who had continued visiting daily, had already thought ahead to this problem. I have a proposal, he said to both Sarah and Rose as they prepared to leave the hospital. If you're both agreeable, I'd like to arrange a private modified tour of the palace for Rose. Something much less strenuous than the regular tour, with plenty of time to rest and enjoy each area at your own pace. Rose's face immediately brightened, but Sarah felt a surge of anxiety. I don't know if that's a good idea, she said carefully. What if something happens again? Guard Williams nodded understandingly. I've already thought of that. I've arranged for a medical staff member to be present throughout the tour, and we'll have a wheelchair available if Rose gets tired. Most importantly, we'll go at whatever pace feels comfortable for her. He turned to address Rose directly. Mrs. Mitchell, this would be completely up to you. If at any point you feel tired or unwell, we stop immediately. No pressure, no schedule to keep. Just a chance to see the things you've dreamed of seeing, in a way that's safe and comfortable. Rose looked at Sarah with pleading eyes. Dear, I came all this way to see the palace. I know it's risky, but I can't bear the thought of going home without finishing what we started. Sarah found herself torn between protecting her grandmother and honoring her wishes. Guard Williams seemed to sense her internal conflict. Sarah, he said gently, I give you my word that your grandmother's safety will be my top priority. At the first sign of any distress, we'll stop the tour immediately. I have 12 years of experience with medical emergencies, and the palace medical staff will be on hand. She'll be as safe as she would be anywhere else. After much discussion and reassurance from Dr. Patel that gentle activity would actually be good for Rose's recovery, Sarah agreed to the private tour. The next morning, a palace car arrived at their hotel to transport them back to Buckingham Palace. Sarah was nervous, but Rose was practically glowing with excitement. She had dressed in her finest outfit, a navy blue dress and matching hat that she had bought specifically for this trip. I feel like the Queen herself, Rose whispered to Sarah as they were escorted through a private entrance to the palace. Guard Williams met them at the entrance, but he wasn't alone. With him was an older woman in elegant civilian dress who introduced herself as Mrs. Henderson, the palace's guest relations coordinator. Mrs. Mitchell, Mrs. Henderson said warmly. Guard Williams has told us all about you, and we're absolutely delighted to give you a proper palace welcome. What followed was unlike any tourist experience Sarah had ever witnessed. Instead of being herded through rooms with dozens of other visitors, Rose was given a truly personalized tour. They moved slowly through each room, with Guard Williams and Mrs. Henderson sharing stories and historical details that weren't part of the regular tour. In the white drawing room, Rose was allowed to sit in a comfortable chair while Mrs. Henderson told her about the room's history and the famous people who had been entertained there. In the ballroom, Guard Williams arranged for Rose to hear a brief performance by a palace musician who happened to be practicing. This piano was played by famous composers who visited the palace, the musician explained to Rose. Would you like to hear a piece that might have been performed here over 100 years ago? As the beautiful music filled the grand ballroom, Rose sat in her wheelchair with tears of joy streaming down her face. I never imagined anything like this, she whispered to Sarah. It's like being in a fairy tale. The tour lasted 3 hours, with frequent breaks for rest and refreshments. At each stop, Rose was treated not like a tourist, but like an honored guest. Palace staff members who weren't even part of the tour made special efforts to greet her and share little stories about their work. The highlight came when they reached the palace gardens. Guard Williams had kept his promise to show Rose this area personally, and it was clear he had saved the best for last. The gardens were in full spring bloom, with roses, tulips, and daffodils creating a riot of color against the backdrop of the palace walls. These gardens have been maintained for over 300 years, Guard Williams explained as he pushed Rose's wheelchair along the gravel paths. Each season brings different flowers, but spring is my favorite. Everything is coming back to life. Rose reached out to touch the petals of a particularly beautiful rose bush. It's perfect, she said softly. Everything about this day has been perfect. As their palace tour concluded, Sarah expected their extraordinary experience to end there. Guard Williams had already gone far beyond any reasonable expectation of duty or kindness. However, he had one more surprise planned for Rose. Mrs. Mitchell, he said as they returned to the palace's main entrance, there's someone who would very much like to meet you. Sarah and Rose exchanged puzzled glances as Guard Williams led them to a small, elegant room Sarah hadn't seen before. Inside, waiting, with a warm smile, was an elderly woman in a simple but beautifully tailored dress. Mrs. Mitchell, Guard Williams said formally, I'd like you to meet Lady Catherine Pemberton, one of Her Majesty's ladies-in-waiting. Rose gasped softly, clearly overwhelmed by this unexpected introduction. Lady Catherine approached with genuine warmth, extending her hand to Rose. My dear Mrs. Mitchell, Lady Catherine said in a refined but kindly voice, Guard Williams has told me about your visit and your love of royal history. I understand you've waited quite a long time to make this trip. Oh my, Rose managed to say, clearly starstruck but trying to maintain her composure. I can't believe I'm meeting you. This is all so incredible. Lady Catherine sat down beside Rose, creating an atmosphere of intimate conversation rather than formal presentation. I understand you have quite a knowledge of royal history yourself. Guard Williams mentioned that you know stories about the coronation in 1953. What followed was a 20-minute conversation between two women who shared a deep appreciation for British history and tradition. Lady Catherine shared personal anecdotes about her decades of service to the royal family, while Rose told stories passed down from her own grandmother about royal celebrations and events from the early 1900s. Sarah watched in amazement as her grandmother, who had been a factory worker's wife from Manchester, conversed easily with aristocracy as if they were old friends. The class differences seemed to disappear in their shared enthusiasm for history and tradition. You know, Lady Catherine said thoughtfully, people often ask me what I find most rewarding about my service to the crown. I always tell them it's moments like this. Meeting people like you who truly appreciate the history and tradition we're privileged to be part of. Before they left, Lady Catherine presented Rose with a small, beautifully wrapped gift. This is a book about the palace's history, with photographs and stories that aren't available to the general public. I'd like you to have it as a memento of your visit. Rose accepted the gift with trembling hands, clearly fighting back tears. of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "This has been the most wonderful day of my life." As they prepared to leave the palace for the final time, Guard Williams accompanied them to their car. Sarah could see that Rose was tired but exhilarated, her energy sustained by the incredible experiences of the day. "Guard Williams," Sarah said, struggling to find adequate words, "I don't know how we can ever repay you for what you've done for us." "You don't need to repay anything," he replied sincerely. "Seeing your grandmother's joy today has been payment enough. This is what I'll remember about my service here. Not the ceremonies or the protocols, but the day we made someone's dream come true." He handed Sarah a card with his personal contact information. "Please stay in touch and let me know how Mrs. Mitchell is doing. And if you're ever in London again, I hope you'll visit. The palace gates are always open to friends." That evening, back at their hotel, Rose sat in her chair carefully examining every page of Lady Catherine's gift book. Her energy had returned completely, and she spent hours telling Sarah about each detail of their remarkable day. "You know, dear," Rose said as she prepared for bed, "when I collapsed in the palace, I thought our trip was ruined. I was so worried that I had spoiled everything for you." "Grandma, you didn't spoil anything," Sarah assured her. "But that's just it," Rose continued. "What I thought was a disaster turned into the most magical experience I could have imagined. If I hadn't gotten sick, we never would have met Guard Williams. We never would have had that private tour or met Lady Catherine. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best memories." Sarah reflected on her grandmother's words. 3 days ago she had been terrified and crying on a palace floor, certain that their dream trip had become a nightmare. Now, they had experienced something that money couldn't buy and that few tourists would ever have the opportunity to enjoy. "Guard Williams told me something while you were resting today," Rose said quietly. "He said that in all his years at the palace, he's never arranged anything like this for visitors. He said there was just something special about our story that touched him." "What do you think made it special?" Sarah asked. Rose thought for a moment. "I think it was because we genuinely cared about each other and weren't afraid to show it. When I collapsed, your tears weren't just about embarrassment or inconvenience. They were about love." Guard Williams recognized that, and he responded with the same kind of love. The next morning brought their departure day. Guard Williams had arranged for a car to take them to the airport, and he personally came to the hotel to see them off. Rose had written him a long letter thanking him for his kindness, and she presented it to him along with a small gift, a photograph of her late husband in his military uniform during World War II. "I thought you might like to have this," she said. He would have been proud to know that his wife was helped by someone who truly understands what service means. Guard Williams accepted the photograph with obvious emotion. "I'll treasure this, Mrs. Mitchell, and I'll never forget you or this experience." As their car pulled away from the hotel, Sarah and Rose waved goodbye to Guard Williams, who stood at attention in his red uniform, saluting them as they departed. It was a gesture of respect and honor that neither of them would ever forget. 6 months after their return to Manchester, Sarah received a letter addressed to both her and Rose. The return address showed Buckingham Palace, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she recognized Guard Williams's handwriting. Inside was a formal invitation, written on elegant palace stationery. Guard Williams had been promoted to senior guard and was receiving a commendation for exceptional service. The letter explained that he had specifically requested that Sarah and Rose be invited as his personal guests to witness the ceremony. "He's receiving an award," Sarah told Rose excitedly, "and he wants us to be there." Rose, who had made a full recovery and returned to her active lifestyle, was thrilled by the invitation. "Of course we must go," she declared. "After everything he did for us, we need to be there to celebrate his success." The ceremony was held in the palace's grand hall, a room they hadn't seen during their previous visit. Sarah and Rose were seated in the front row, treated as honored guests rather than mere spectators. They watched with pride as Guard Williams, resplendent in his dress uniform, received his commendation from a senior royal official. The citation read aloud during the ceremony specifically mentioned his exceptional care and dedication in assisting palace visitors during medical emergencies, and his outstanding representation of British hospitality and service. While the citation didn't mention Rose and Sarah by name, they knew they were part of the story that had led to this recognition. After the ceremony, Guard Williams found them in the reception area. His joy at seeing them again was obvious and infectious. "I can't believe you came all this way," he said, clearly moved by their presence. "We wouldn't have missed it for the world," Rose replied firmly. "You saved my life, gave me the most wonderful day I could have imagined, and now look at you, being recognized for your exceptional service. We're so proud of you, Guard Williams." Introduced them to his colleagues and supervisors as the special visitors who taught me what true service really means. Sarah was touched to realize that their experience had been as meaningful to him as it had been to them. During the reception, Lady Catherine Pemberton approached them with a warm smile. "Mrs. Mitchell, how wonderful to see you again. You look absolutely radiant." "I feel wonderful," Rose replied honestly. "And I look at that book you gave me almost every day. It's become my most treasured possession." Lady Catherine looked pleased. "I'm so glad it brings you joy. You know, your story has become quite famous around here. Guard Williams' actions that day have inspired changes in how we handle visitor emergencies. He's become something of a legend among the staff." As the evening progressed, Sarah learned more about the impact their experience had created. Guard Williams had used their story to propose new protocols for assisting visitors with medical emergencies. The palace had implemented training programs to help staff provide better support to guests in distress, and they had established partnerships with local hospitals to ensure faster response times. "Your grandmother's emergency became a catalyst for positive change," Mrs. Henderson, the guest relations coordinator, explained to Sarah. "Guard Williams presented your case as an example of how personal compassion and professional duty could work together to create exceptional service." Before they left that evening, Guard Williams had one final surprise. He led them to a quiet corner of the palace where a small plaque had been installed near the throne room. In recognition of exceptional service to palace visitors, the plaque read, "And in memory of the importance of compassion and duty, dedicated to all staff who go beyond protocol to serve with heart." "This is beautiful," Sarah said, reading the inscription carefully. "It was inspired by our experience together," Guard Williams explained. "The palace administration wanted to acknowledge that sometimes the most important service we provide isn't about following rules. It's about recognizing when someone needs help and responding with genuine care." Rose reached out to touch the plaque gently. "I can't believe that our story led to something like this." "Your story reminded all of us why we're really here," Guard Williams said. "Yes, we protect tradition and serve the crown, but more importantly, we serve people. Real people with real dreams and real needs." As they prepared to leave London once again, the farewells were emotional but joyful. Guard Williams had become like family to them, and they had become part of his own story of service and dedication. "Promise me you'll stay in touch," Rose insisted, hugging him tightly. "And promise me you'll continue being the wonderful man you are." "I promise," Guard Williams replied. "And I promise that every time I help someone in need, I'll think of you and remember what real service looks like." The flight home was quiet. Both Sarah and Rose lost in reflection about their remarkable journey. What had begun as a simple tourist trip had become a story about human kindness, about how strangers can become family, and about how the worst moments can sometimes lead to the most beautiful experiences. "You know what I learned from all this?" Rose said as their plane approached Manchester. "What's that, Grandma?" "I learned that the most important thing about any place isn't the buildings or the history or even the famous people," Rose said thoughtfully. "It's the ordinary people who choose to be extraordinary when someone needs them to be." Sarah smiled, thinking about Guard Williams and how he had transformed from a uniformed figure of authority into a caring friend who had gone far beyond any expectation of duty. "I learned something too," Sarah said. "I learned that sometimes the best adventures happen when everything goes wrong. If you hadn't gotten sick, we would have had a nice ordinary tour and gone home with nice ordinary memories. Instead, Rose finished with a grin, we got an extraordinary story that we'll tell for the rest of our lives. Years later, whenever Rose told the story of her collapse at Buckingham Palace and the guard who became their guardian angel, she always ended it the same way. I burst into tears that day, thinking everything was ruined. But that palace guard did something I'll never forget. He showed me that sometimes our worst moments are just the beginning of our best memories. Guard Williams continued his distinguished career at the palace, eventually becoming head of visitor services. He never forgot the lesson that Rose and Sarah had taught him, that behind every tourist is a real person with real dreams, deserving of compassion and care. And in a small display case in his office, he kept a photograph of an elderly woman in a navy blue dress and matching hat, smiling radiantly in the palace gardens, surrounded by spring flowers in full bloom. Below the photograph was a simple inscription, Mrs. Rose Mitchell, Teacher of True Service. The story of the palace guard who went beyond duty became part of palace lore, told to new staff members as an example of what exceptional service really means. But for Sarah, Rose, and Guard Williams, it was much more than a story. It was proof that kindness between strangers can create bonds that last a lifetime and memories that shine brighter than any palace gold.